In this video, we're going to talk about common types of questions that will show up on the ACT English test. There are at least 4 major types of questions that consistently show up on the ACT English test. Question type number 1, using correct punctuation. For these types of questions, you're going to need to figure out which punctuation mark to use and where the punctuation mark should go. The types of punctuation marks that will show up are commas, dashes, semicolons, colons, apostrophes, and parentheses. The best way to get these questions correct is to study the rules for each of these punctuation marks and to take practice tests to figure out the consistent ways the punctuation shows up on the ACT English test. Question type number 2, choosing the correct form or word. For these types of questions, you're going to need to figure out the correct or best word to use for a sentence. Some questions will ask you to choose the correct verb form or tense, such as present or past tense or singular or plural. Others might ask you to choose the correct pronoun, such as singular or plural pronoun. Other questions might ask you to choose the correct preposition to use. For questions that deal with the correct form of a part of speech, the best way to prepare for these questions is to study the rules for the different parts of speech and their forms, such as subject-verb agreement, pronoun rules, the differences between adjectives and adverbs, etc. Other questions will simply ask you to choose an answer that uses the correct wording according to common idiomatic English usage. This means that we need to look for an answer that reflects the way that we just normally say something in English. The best way to prepare for these kinds of questions is to simply read a lot so that you will just recognize what looks and sounds right. Question type number 3, logic questions. For these kinds of questions, we'll need to choose the answer that expresses the correct relationship between 2 parts of a sentence, or paragraph, or passage. We might be asked to pick the correct conjunction, such as but, which expresses contrast, or and, which doesn't express contrast. To do this, we'll need to look at the relationship between the 2 parts of the sentence. Other questions might ask us to choose where a sentence should go in a particular paragraph, or maybe in the entire passage. To do this, we'll need to look at the context and figure out the sentences that naturally lead into this sentence and that naturally come after this sentence. We'll be looking for related ideas and appropriate transitions. For these types of questions, the best way to deal with them is to look at the relationships between the sentences and parts of sentences. When we need to choose the correct conjunction or transitional word, pay attention to whether the 2 things we need to relate are contrasted or not. Usually, this alone will help us determine the correct choice. For other questions, we'll just need to look at the context to find related ideas to the specific question being asked, as well as figure out what the correct flow of these sentences should be. Sometimes, if a sentence is unnecessary, is repeated elsewhere, or is irrelevant, we should simply leave it out. Other times, if the sentence contributes something useful to the passage, then we'll need to include it and understand why we're including it. Question type number 4, main idea and interpretation questions. For these types of questions, we'll need to figure out what the main point of the passage is, or what the meaning of a particular paragraph or sentence is. To do these kinds of questions, we'll need to ask the question, what is the purpose of this passage or sentence or paragraph? In the next video, we'll talk about the best strategy for skipping and circling questions for the ACT English test. Thanks for watching, and I will see you there.